The image most of us have of the Apostle Paul is almost a caricature, an old, bald, stern man, and above all, lonely. Before monks even existed, someone who had no time for romance, who viewed marriage as a distraction, and who possibly harbored a certain disdain for women. For centuries, Christian tradition, especially from the Middle Ages onward, painted Paul as the patron saint of celibacy, the man who chose solitude to serve God. But what if this image is a fabrication? What if, behind the theological letters and missionary journeys, there was a painful secret that the church preferred to forget? What if Paul was not a confirmed bachelor, but a man who lived through a devastating marital drama or early widowhood? Today, we are reopening the file on Paul's life. We are going to look at Jewish evidence, Sanhedrin laws, and clues left between the lines of the original Greek that suggest a shocking truth. Paul was likely married, and the story of what happened to his wife could completely change the way you read the New Testament. If you are tired of hearing the same version of history and want real depth, based on historical facts and biblical archaeology, subscribe to the channel right now. Here, we are not afraid to ask the hard questions, because historical truth only strengthens mature faith. Join our community of investigators. To understand why the idea of a single Paul is historically unlikely, we need to forget our modern context. Today, a single 30-year-old man is common. In the Jewish world of the first century, this was an aberration. Paul was not a common Jew. He was the elite of the elite. He describes himself as a Jew of Hebrews, a Pharisee, son of Pharisees, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, the greatest teacher of the law of that time. We need to understand what this means. Jewish society was structured around the primordial commandment of Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. For a devout Jew, marriage was not a lifestyle choice. It was a religious duty. The Talmud, which compiles the oral traditions of that time, said that a man who does not marry and have children is as if he has shed blood. That is, he has diminished the image of God on earth. There was a rabbinic saying that went, at 18, to the bridal canopy, a man who reached 20 without marrying was considered cursed by God, someone whose bones would swell. Now, at Saul of Tarsus, he was not a rebel against the Jewish system. He was the ultimate defender of the system. He was so zealous for the traditions of his fathers that he persecuted Christians to death. Does it make any sense that this man, who followed every comma of the law, would violate the most basic commandment of Jewish culture and remain single? If Saul were single at 30, he would be seen as a social pariah, someone with some grave moral or physical deficiency. He would never have had the meteoric rise he had within Judaism if he were a celibate. Gamaliel, his master, belonged to the school of Hillel, which valued the family. It is inconceivable that Gamaliel's star pupil was a bachelor. The first proof that Paul was married is not in the Bible, it is in sociology. A strict, celibate Pharisee is a contradiction in terms in the first century. But the evidence gets stronger when we look at Saul's political career before his conversion. In Acts chapter 26, verse 10, Paul is defending himself before King Agrippa and says something revealing about his time as a persecutor, and that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests I put many of the Lord's people in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. The Greek word for vote here is xiphos, which literally means pebble or stone. This is a reference to the voting system of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Israel. To condemn someone to death, as in the case of Stephen, the members of the tribunal placed a black pebble in the urn. Paul is saying, in black and white, that he had voting power in capital cases. This brings us to our second proof, and it is devastating. To be a member of the Sanhedrin, or even to have official voting authority on commissions linked to it, there were rigorous requirements. The candidate needed to be wise, modest, physically healthy, have knowledge of magic to judge sorcerers, speak languages, and crucially, be married and have children. Why? Because the rabbis believed that a man who was not a father would not have the necessary mercy to judge cases of life and death. A single man was considered too cruel or incomplete to hold the power of the sword. If Paul cast his vote to kill Christians, He very likely was part of this official structure that required marriage as a prerequisite of character. The idea of a young, single Saul voting in the Sanhedrin is a historical anachronism. So, if he was married, where is his wife? Why does she never appear on the missionary journeys? Why does he never send greetings to her? This is where history stops being just a legal analysis and becomes a human drama of epic proportions. We have three possibilities: either she died, or she abandoned him, or she traveled with him and we simply didn't notice. Let's explore the tragedy hypothesis first, because it sheds new light on Paul's personality. Imagine the moment of Paul's conversion. He is returning from Damascus blind, confused, transformed. He leaves home as the hero of Orthodox Judaism, the prosecutor who is going to wipe out heresy. He returns as a traitor. He returns preaching the crucified carpenter is the Messiah. For a strict Pharisaic family, this was not just a change of religion, it was unbearable shame. There was a practice in ancient Judaism which still exists in some ultra-Orthodox communities today of holding a symbolic funeral for a son or husband who converted to another faith or became an apostate. The family considered the person dead. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 8, Paul writes one of the most emotional sentences in the Bible: "Yes, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ." We usually read all things as if he were talking about status, money, or pride. But what if all things included his wife and children? What if, upon embracing the cross, he arrived home and found the door locked? What if his wife, faithful to the tradition of her fathers and pressured by her high-class family, was forced to divorce him or chose to leave him because he became a follower of the Nazarene? This would explain the melancholy that sometimes permeates his letters. This would explain why he speaks of the suffering of losing everything with such authority. He didn't just lose his job, he lost the love of his life. This theory of abandonment or divorce because of faith fits perfectly with the advice he gives in 1 Corinthians 7. He tells Christians, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. Why would Paul open this specific exception? Perhaps because he was living it himself. Perhaps he was the brother who was no longer bound because the unbelieving wife, Orthodox Jew, left. If this is true, Paul was not an insensitive bachelor. He was a divorce against his will, a man who sacrificed his marital happiness on the altar of his obedience to Jesus. But there is another possibility, perhaps even sadder: widowhood. Many scholars believe Paul was a widower when he began his itinerant ministry. Mortality in the ancient world was extremely high. Women died in childbirth with frightening frequency. If Paul married at 18 or 20, as was the custom, and began his ministry at 30 or 35, he could very well have lost his wife to illness. This would explain why, in 1 Corinthians 7-8, he says, "Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do." Note that he groups himself mentally with those who are not married now. In Greek, the word for unmarried here can be generic, but the context of addressing widows suggests he understands the pain of loss. He is saying, I know what it is to be alone after having company. It is hard, but it can be a tool to serve God without distractions. This view of a widower Paul deeply humanizes the apostle. Suddenly, when he speaks about death being swallowed up in victory, or about the comfort of God in all tribulation, it isn't abstract theology. It is the cry of a man who held the hand of a dying wife and had to find hope in the midst of grief. This transforms the misogynist into a man who loved and lost, and who channeled that emotional energy to care for the church, the bride of Christ. Now, we need to look at a text that is often ignored, but could be the definitive proof that Paul not only was married, but that he claimed the right to be married, even during his ministry. In 1 Corinthians 9-5, Paul is defending his apostolic authority against critics who said he wasn't a real apostle like Peter and the others. He asks, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas. Stop and think about that phrase. Paul says that the other apostles and the Lord's brothers, like James and Cephas, Peter traveled with their wives. This, in itself, already explodes the Roman Catholic myth that the apostles were celibate. Peter took his wife on missions. James took his wife. And Paul says, "Don't I have the same right?" The Greek grammar here implies that the possibility was open. Some argue he was saying, "I could take one, but I chose not to." Others suggest something more intriguing, that he perhaps had a wife, but due to the extreme dangers of his travels, shipwrecks, floggings, prisons, they decided, by mutual agreement, that she would stay safely in a base church, perhaps in Antioch or Tarsus, while he went to the front lines of battle. In this scenario, Paul's celibacy would not be a rejection of marriage, but a strategic and temporary sacrifice. He would be living as a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, not because he didn't have a wife, but because he gave up daily cohabitation so that the gospel could reach the Gentiles. This would explain the sexual and emotional tension he addresses in his letters. He does not speak like someone who has no desires. He speaks like someone who controls his desires with iron discipline. In 1 Corinthians 7, he says, "It is better to marry than to burn with passion." This is not the speech of a frigid man. It is the speech of a passionate man who knows the power of the fire. But the evidence doesn't stop there. Let's dive into the very language Paul uses to describe marriage. If he were a virgin bachelor who never touched a woman, his advice on sex and intimacy would be theoretical, distant, perhaps even naive. But when we read 1 Corinthians 7, we find surprising realism. He talks about conjugal duty. He says the husband's body belongs to the wife and the wife's to the husband. He advises against long periods of sexual abstinence within marriage, so that Satan will not tempt you. He understands the day-to-day dynamics, the physical and emotional need. He doesn't speak like a priest who read about marriage in books. He speaks like a man who lived the routine of sharing a bed, bills, and worries. The level of psychological detail about intimacy suggests lived experience. Continuing our investigation into the secret life of the Apostle Paul, we now arrive at one of the most fascinating and mysterious clues in the entire New Testament. It is hidden in a name, or rather, in a Greek word in the letter to the Philippians, chapter 4, verse 3. Paul is asking for help for two women, Euodia and Syntyche, who are fighting. And then he addresses someone very specific. "And I ask you also, true companion, help these women." The expression, true companion, in Greek is syzygos. Some translators treat this as an adjective, yokefellow, but many scholars believe that syzygos could be a proper name or, even more shockingly, a term of endearment for a wife. The word syzygos literally means one who is united under the same yoke. In other contexts of Greek literature, this word is used to describe a spouse. Is it possible that Paul was addressing his wife? There is a historical theory, defended by theologians like Clement of Alexandria as early as the 2nd century, that Paul was married and that this mysterious person in Philippians was his wife. If we assume Paul was a widower or separated, this theory falls. But if we consider the possibility that he had a wife who stayed behind or served in a specific capacity in the church of Philippi, the text takes on a new color. Imagine Paul, imprisoned in Rome, writing to the church he loved most, and sending a direct message to his yokefellow, asking her to use her female authority to reconcile the two church leaders. "Help them, you, my faithful wife." This would explain the intimacy and implied trust in the request. It is not an order to a subordinate. It is a request to an equal. Of course, most modern translations prefer the safe option of loyal companion, referring perhaps to Silas, Timothy, or Luke. But the ambiguity of the Greek remains. And the very existence of this ambiguity reminds us that we are reading the correspondence of a real man, with real TIs, and not a sterile theological treatise. If Syzygos was Paul's wife, this would confirm 1 Corinthians 9:5. He had the right, and possibly, the reality of a believing wife, even if the circumstances of ministry kept them physically separated for long periods. Let's go back now to Paul's psychology. There is a subtle but powerful argument in the way he treats women in general. A misogynist, or a confirmed celibate who views women as dangerous temptation, tends to pull away, to create barriers, to silence. But Paul does the opposite. He is always surrounded by powerful women. Lydia, the businesswoman who funded the church of Philippi. Priscilla, the theologian he mentions before her husband. Eunia, the apostle. Phoebe, the deacon. A man who lived in a happy marriage, or who deeply suffered the loss of one, tends to view women as partners, as equals. Naturally, the respect Paul shows for these leaders suggests he was not afraid of women. He was used to female strength. This fits much more with the profile of a man who had a strong, intelligent wife by his side, someone like Priscilla, someone capable of debating Torah and managing a household, than with a monk isolated in the desert. So, why did the church hide this? Why have we spent 2,000 years hearing that the Christian ideal is Paul's celibacy? The answer lies in the political history of the church. Starting in the 4th century, with the rise of monasticism and the influence of Greek philosophies that viewed the body and sex as inferior or dirty things, there was a systematic effort to clean up the image of the heroes of the faith. Augustine and other church fathers, fighting their own sexual battles, projected onto Paul their ideal of ascetic holiness. To them, a saint couldn't have sex. A saint couldn't change diapers. So, Peter having a mother-in-law was explained away as something from the past, and Paul was transformed into the icon of perpetual virginity. But this distortion comes at a high cost. It creates a barrier between the pulpit and the pew. It suggests that to be really holy, you need to be less human, less connected, less emotional. When we rescue the historical Paul, the Jewish Paul, the Pharisee Paul, the Sanhedrin member Paul, the widower or divorced Paul for the sake of Christ, we gain a much more impressive hero. Think about the sacrifice. If Paul was single by choice and didn't care for romance, giving up marriage was no sacrifice at all. It was just convenience. But if he was a passionate man, raised to value family above all else, who had a wife and lost her whether to death or religious rejection, then his dedication to the gospel gains a heroic dimension. He didn't serve God because he had nothing better to do. He served God while carrying an open wound in his chest. He traveled the world caring for churches like a father cares for children, perhaps because he himself could no longer embrace his own biological children, or because he had lost them when he became a Christian. This rewrites entire passages. When he says in 2 Corinthians 11 about his daily concern for all the churches, we see the sublimation of fatherhood. When he says in 1 Thessalonians 2-7 that he was, like a nursing mother caring for her children, we see the tenderness of someone who knew family dynamics up close. Paul's theology was not born in a cold library. It was born in the living room, in loss, in longing, and in the hope of resurrection. And here, we come to the final proof, which is not textual, but theological. The central metaphor Paul uses to explain the mystery of the gospel is marriage. In Ephesians 5, he says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church." He calls marriage a great mystery. How could someone who despised marriage or who never experienced it elevate this institution to the supreme level of being the mirror of God? Paul saw marriage as something sacred, something worthy of being compared to the blood of Christ. Only a man who understood the depth of the marital covenant could have the audacity to say that a man's love for a woman is the best image we have of God's love for us. So, what is the verdict? The historical evidence, the Jewish requirement for marriage, the vote in the Sanhedrin, the Pharisaic culture points overwhelmingly to the fact that Saul of Tarsus was married at some point. The textual evidence, the lost all things, the true companion, the intimate knowledge of married life, suggests he carried the marks of that relationship. Whether he was widowed or abandoned, we cannot state with absolute certainty, but we can state with confidence, Paul was not the cold celibate we were told about. And why does this matter to you today? Because it takes the Bible off the unreachable pedestal and puts it into real life. It shows that God uses people with complex pasts, with family pain, with complicated marital status. If you are divorced, Paul understands your pain of rejection. If you are a widower, Paul understands your lonely grief. If you are single and waiting, Paul understands your struggle for purity. He is not a plaster saint. He is an older brother who walked the path of pain before us. The truth is that the lie of celibacy served an institutional agenda, but the historical truth serves the human heart. Paul was a complete man, and it was in his broken humanity, not in an alien holiness, that the grace of God was perfected. If this investigation changed the way you see the greatest apostle of Christianity, if it made you feel a new connection with the scriptures, then my work here was worth it. But don't let this conversation die. The history of Christianity is full of dark corners we need to illuminate. What else have we been told that isn't quite true? What else has tradition invented? To continue this journey of discovery, I need you to do 3 things now. First, leave a like if you learned something new. Second, comment below. Which theory makes more sense to you, Paul the widower or Paul abandoned by his wife? I want to read your opinion. And third, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Our next documentary will touch on an even more controversial topic, and you won't want to miss it. The truth sets you free. But first, it may shock you. Be prepared. Until the next investigation.